Georgia went to Rocky Top and they embarrassed the Tennessee Volunteers. After Tennessee scored that running touchdown, their first offensive possession of this game, Georgia didn't allow these boys to have too much success offensively after. And I don't know what it is about Georgia's defense and allowing teams to score points on their opening possessions on offense. We saw the same thing happen against Florida. For some reason, Georgia's defense, they just say, F it. We're just going to allow teams to have a little bit of success their first possession, and then after that, we're just going to body bag you, because this was a body bag special, people. And you would have thought that Tennessee would have been able to keep this game much closer than what it was with them playing at home. You know, all this week I heard Tennessee fans screaming at me, man, Carson Beck could struggle in this game. This is his first game against a truly hostile environment on the road. Well, you know what Carson Beck did in his first true test in a hostile environment? Well, he went 24-30, 298 passing yards and 3 touchdowns, and he had no interceptions. You know, Georgia, this year's team isn't as good as their previous championship teams, but they're still really good. And not every single team is the same team that they were the previous year. Every single season, you get a new team. This Georgia team offensively is the deepest and the most talented that it's been at skill position ever under Kirby Smart. I can't recall ever seeing Kirby Smart's offenses being this deep and stacked at wide receiver. I mean, you have Rosemary, Jack Saint, who had 7 receptions for 91 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. Dylan Bell was going on. Didn't really hear this guy's name for a majority of this season until this game. Then you got Brock Bowers, who we already know about. He's one of the best players in all of college football. He was going off. But Carson Beck put together a masterful performance against a really good Tennessee defense. And Tennessee, they just got dominated on all phases of the game. Special teams, offense, defense. Joe Milton, he had a really disappointing performance in this game. If Tennessee was going to have a shot at pulling off this upset, they needed Joe Milton to come out and have a Heisman-worthy performance. When you look at Joe Milton from a talent standpoint, he has all the physical tools and attributes to be a really great quarterback, especially in the NFL. But in this game, he wasn't able to make enough big-time throws downfield. These receivers weren't able to challenge this Georgia secondary, which kind of surprised me. I thought that these receivers would have had a lot more success than what they did in this game against this Georgia secondary, because these receivers are really good and they're really talented. But the fact that Joe Milton wasn't able to have too much time to throw the football, the fact that this Georgia pass rush actually showed up to play in this game, and outside of that big run, Tennessee's rushing attack got pretty much shut down for all of this game right after that opening touchdown run that they had to start this game. That was it. And then they got a field goal right before halftime, and that's all the offense they could muster. You know, this game has been pretty much a clear indicator of how this season has went for Tennessee offensively anytime they've went against a competent defense. Against Alabama, in the first half of that game, they scored 20 points going into halftime, and then Alabama's defense completely shuts them down. And you can say the same thing for the way that this game went for them offensively, although they didn't score 20 in the first half. They only scored 10, and they didn't score anything in the second half. They lack explosiveness in the passing game when it comes to being able to push the football downfield vertically. And it's not because Joe Milton doesn't have the talent to do that. We know this dude has probably the strongest arm in the history of football, but it's the fact that he doesn't have the accuracy, he doesn't have the touch needed, and the offensive line and pass protection this year has been nowhere good as what it was last season with Hendon Hooker. And Tennessee's defense, although they have been great against an offense like Georgia, they were just outmatched. There was just no way Tennessee was going to be able to stay around in this game without having great quarterback play. To beat Alabama or to beat Georgia, you need 2 things. You need good quarterback play, and you need receivers that are good enough to challenge their secondaries. Tennessee had only one of those things. I still believe their receivers were good enough. It's just that Joe Milton just didn't show up in this game, and you need more out of a guy like Joe Milton. And now he's pretty much done with his collegiate career. I'm eager to see where he lands in the NFL draft because he's a pretty interesting prospect. He does have a lot of upside and a lot of potential, and he hasn't been bad this season. He has been pretty good, but, you know, the difference between him and Hendon Hooker is night and day. Hendon Hooker gave you Heisman caliber play. Joe Milton just gave you good, serviceable quarterback play for this season. And that's why Tennessee's offense kind of had to change their philosophy. This was a team that was known for throwing the football all over the field against you. And now this season, they transformed into a physical run-first team. And when the run game isn't going for Tennessee, they have no success because of their inability to do what they were able to do best in 2022, generating those big plays downfield. And Georgia is going up against Georgia Tech next week, which they probably should manhandle. And then we pretty much get what I believe is the national championship and the SEC championship game, the Bulldogs against the Crimson Tide. I'm really excited for that game. Georgia, as I mentioned earlier, it's funny because although they're not as good as what they have been when they've won back-to-back national championships, they still are arguably the best team in college football. This team is just so deep offensively. The quarterback play has been so good this year, and they're also able to run the football as well. Their defense, you know, at times their defense doesn't play as good as what they have been in the past, but their secondary still is pretty good, although they did give up a couple of big plays against Vanderbilt. For the most part, this still is one of the best teams in college football, and you don't think about Georgia in that way because the level of expectations that you have for this team, performance-wise, is always so high that it's kind of hard for them to top that. And it's kind of easy to overlook just how truly dominant this team has been this season when you look at how talented they were on defense the previous 2 years. And that's why I was telling a friend of mine a couple of days ago. I was like, even though Georgia isn't the dominant team that we've seen in 2021 and 2022, they're still running through the competition. And it's weird because Georgia, they have a tendency to play down the competition. I remember when they almost lost to Auburn. They gave up 200 yards on the ground. They played down to teams that they should blow out, but then they blow out the teams that are amongst the best in the conference. You beat Missouri pretty handily, even though that game was a lot closer than how the game against Ole Miss and Tennessee were. You blew out Florida. In big games, Georgia plays their best football. And games against teams that they're expected to blow out, they tend to underperform sometimes. But this is still one of the most complete teams in all of college football. They don't really have too many significant flaws other than their secondary being a little bit inconsistent at times, similar to the same issue that Alabama's defense has. Their defense is really good, but their secondary can give up a good amount of big plays over the top. And I think the same thing can kind of be said about Georgia in a sense, although not to the degree as Alabama. But Georgia remains undefeated on the season. You might have thought this was a trap game, but all it was some more dog food that the SEC was feeding to Georgia to continue to boost up their resume and their schedule. Even if Georgia loses in the SEC championship game, there still is an argument for them to get into the college football playoffs. I believe that with how tough their November stretch has been, beating Tennessee on the road, being able to beat Missouri and Ole Miss, two teams that were ranked inside the top 5, top 10, those are 3 really quality wins that if Georgia loses the SEC championship game, even with one loss, I still think they got a significant argument for being included in this year's college football playoffs.